and welcome to another episode of The Focal Thought. My guest today is Faith Johnson. How are you, Faith?
I'm well, thank you.
Most welcome. Thanks for coming on the show today. So, Faith, you are a performance installation artist, a licensed art director, educator, herbalist, and contemplative arts facilitator through your business Full Circle Arts. And you received your MFA from the School of the Museum of Fine Arts through Tufts University. And you also received the Rose Hill Performance Award. So congrats on that, and a teaching fellowship in performance art. And in your work, you use dreams, envisioning, and intuition as artistic materials to be explored both individually and communally through interactive installations and performative actions. So welcome to the show.
Thank you so much for having me, Crichton.
No, it's my pleasure. And I wanted to ask you, because, right off the bat, working with museums, I've always felt that, museums should offer the same sort of spiritual peace that a church might do. So when I go to a church to pray, the environment is set up, the energy is set up for me just to sit there sometimes, maybe, for minutes on end, sometimes, could be hours on end, depending on some people. And, with museums, traditionally, I find, when you go to a museum, you might view an exhibit, but then you're sort of moved along. There's, a lot of traffic sometimes. And what's really unique about you is not only do you provide a space for people, to watch the exhibit, but also more importantly, to interact with the exhibit. So you really do get to spend some time there. And also, you get into sort of a meditative process. And all of this is geared towards, promoting collective consciousness. So I just wanted to ask you how you stemmed with this idea.
Yes. Yeah, in terms of like museums and the art experiences themselves, I know a lot of artists come from really different approaches, but honestly, I see the artists, particularly in the secular Western world, as sort of the spiritual people, if that makes sense. And with my work in particular, well, I'll go back to the museums and gallery spaces because they are, right, kind of sanctified in a way. They're like, this is for this. Like you come in and you contemplate the work. Like that's just the nature of being in a space. But in terms of my own work, I definitely expand on that and make it really central, and not only to create sort of like a sacred space, but also an experience that activates, I guess, who you would normally call the viewer. So in my work, when I started with performance, it was very real, right? It was in real time, real movement, real poetics. And I really liked how immediate and how it lived in time and space. But what was missing for me was that, people would watch the performance. Maybe there'd be a little interactivity, but it was mostly people just watching as opposed to experiencing what I was experiencing or inviting to experience and explore. So I kind of moved through my performance work and into a space of wanting to create actual experiences that were real. Yeah, I guess I hope that answers some of the question.
No, definitely. And I like that you mentioned that, the audience is in a watching state. And too often I find with art, the audience is in a very passive state, and it's very enriching, and you get a whole new experience of the art when you're involved with the art. And that's, on a sensory level, interacting with the art, really spending the time there, becoming the art, to a certain extent. That'll give you a much profound experience, a very different profound experience rather than just sort of sitting and watching the art, right?
Yes. I mean, I think definitely it, because it's sort of, because you get involved in the work, you are invited to be there for a period of time. And if you're invited into the work in real time and space, then you kind of commit to that moment. Like you commit to the beginning and end, if that's the nature of the piece. And in my work, it's an invitation to step in and stay, and then, leave with that experience. So it really calls for attention, and performance work in general, and interactive work, time-based work like that's live. There's something activated that's different than, oh, well, I can come back later, or I liked that piece, but maybe at the end I'll have time to come back and really sit with it. But instead it's like, well, this is happening and it's not going to happen again. It might have another part, or I might do a similar thing somewhere else, but nothing is like that exact time. And whoever's there is going to be different. And that means even if I'm doing the same interactive piece somewhere, it's going to be different each time. And it's based in time.
No, that's right. And then you've ensured the person has absorbed the intent of the piece or the art, rather than, like you're saying, they might think about it and say, hey, I'll come back to that. And right then and there, they're interactive with it. They've absorbed it. So even if they don't come back, they've got something from that piece.
Yes, that's definitely the hope, and that they've left something behind, or contributed to that experience, because it's a shared experience and it's about the shared experience.
Got it. Okay. And fundamental to what you're doing with interacting with the pieces, because, and we'll get into some of this, with some of the interactions that you do, the fundamental aspect is imagination and daydreaming. Now, this is something, Einstein, I think his quote was, imagination is more important than knowledge, because knowledge is limited and imagination encircles the world. And, as kids are naturally, people who daydream. Adults do daydream as well, but maybe not to the extent that, they did when they were kids. And, I myself sometimes, use daydreaming in a creative aspect, sometimes maybe even to put me to sleep, which I find is very effective. So daydreaming is something that's really important for creativity, and also for manifesting. If we talk about the law of attraction, that exists because of the concept of imagination and daydreaming. So if I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about daydreaming, and, maybe get into a bit of a definition, or what that means to you as well.
Yes, absolutely. And I love a lot of those Einstein quotes, because it really, as such a huge figure in the framework of science, he left a lot of space also for imagination, and for other kinds of thinking and knowing, which I think is very key to keeping us open and not stagnant in like, this is a fact and there we go, we're all done. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
So I think, yes, with imagination, how I see it, it's, if we can't imagine something, in my experience and understanding, it will never be. Like, if you can't see it first in your mind, or someone can first see it in their mind, it's not going to come through into that framework that we understand as knowledge. So how I see it is that imagination and that sort of intuitive dream space, it's like this huge information highway. And we create these little inroads that come through us based on, who we are and what we've come to do in the world. But once it, we have to pull it in from that place, and then it becomes knowledge. And then it becomes facts. And then it becomes X, Y, and Z. So I see it as this very like folding into the material world. So ideas and imagination are very, very large, huge containers. And then to activate them, they really have to be filtered through lots of systems, and in a way getting really kind of tight in order to like bring it into the useful everyday world. And the trick is to balance those two, is harnessing the imagination so that we can put it to use in our world, but also not getting stagnant in the ways in which we understand knowledge and the ways we sit with facts. Because I of course, I'm not a scientist, but I think about hundreds of years ago, folks who are like scientists and had facts, right? And then years later, those facts are no longer facts. So I think that there's some thread there to remember that these things are malleable, and that it's super important, I think, to have a balance between those two and really keep our space open for how we know things and the ways that we know them and how we're generating knowledge within ourselves and each other. So that's part one. And I know you asked about like daydreams and how I see what the definition of that is. And the definition I have is pretty loose. I think it all comes from the same place where your mind wanders and you sort of let it go free in that open expanse. And it puts you in this other sort of maybe state oftentimes, which, in some cultures, maybe it's more like, slightly a trance state, maybe. I don't know. But it does put you in this other space of like kind of opening up to your intuition, and opening up to, that intuition. I think is like your funnel and your like lens as an individual. So the daydream space is like really being open to ideas and letting yourself expand your consciousness a bit. And then you kind of bring in whatever golden sparkle that sort of attaches to your own knowing and then kind of comes through there. When I think of daydream in my work, it's kind of more about that, maybe a little bit more about that in-between space that you mentioned before. But instead, we're kind of doing it together through a meditative space. So we're kind of getting into that space together. And the idea is, first of all and foremost, to hold open a space for that. So everyone can kind of arrive there on some level, because I do think it's innate to human beings to be able to access in that way. And then the second thing I'll say before, I slow down with all my words here, is that I think when we get together and we access that place together, it creates a bigger space of knowing. So it's not just me and it's not just you, but now we have a group of people. And I think it's a different kind of like gathering those threads together and expanding on them. And it really becomes more of a collective. And the power of that is that, can we imagine the world we really want to be in? What does that look like? And how can we like access that together and just vision? And I really work in that space of visioning. That's like my, other people work a little bit more in the like, now we got to put it to work, but I love to hold that space of visioning. And anyway, I won't talk about the connection to my water project yet, but I think that's a lot.
No, I was gonna
ask
later about the three mountain waters,
Mm-hmm.
but I like that you're doing this with the end goal of collective consciousness, because there's some sort of unity in that. So when people go to a church of their choice, and there's that collective community there. If you go to a musical concert, there's that collective community there. And then when there are others who are on the same wavelength as you, that's very, powerful and inspiring as well.
Absolutely. I think it's, without, I don't want to disrespect any of those specific cultural institutions, because they have, it's very precious, but it is my understanding that those are all kind of leading and feeding off of the same beautiful pool, if that makes sense.
Correct. Yeah.
Yeah.
The same source.
Yes, the same source.
Okay. So with daydreaming, because we're getting into the topic of creativity here, and also the motivation to get people to be able to be free from their own thoughts, their own mind, their own insecurities, to allow the imagination to reach, its highest extent. And I say highest, and very sort of relatively. I often find that when people get into a creative mode, they need sort of help with things like, caffeine, psychedelics, etc., things of that nature. And we've seen, in the past world, in past times, where authors and musicians, etc., they've needed to use these things to create their works, and they've created, fantastic pieces of work. But if you look at someone like Hemingway, he enjoyed his alcohol. And if we look at collectively the people today who do the 9 to 5, a lot of work, I believe, is accomplished because of coffee, right? I mean, you take away the coffee, it can probably, definitely slow down productivity. So from this work that you do with daydreaming, because even with the work that you're doing, I mean, you're not using, psychedelics or alcohol or caffeine or anything, but you are using things like water and space and, light and crystals, and, you've got gold hands, you've got objects for remembering, things like that. What is the best way someone can alleviate their insecurities to allow, the river of creativity to flow through them to their highest extent? Do you have any tips for that without relying on certain crutches?
Yeah. So I mean, I think you bring up something, really important, and yeah, all of those things, there's a lot of, it's without judgment that I say shortcuts, but, everybody, and also some of those inroads are very deeply cultural, of course, too, and have a lot of containers around the usage of, say, psychedelics. So I'm trying to think of tips. So obviously there's like a million ways to do stuff. And I think the things, so if you have a practice, like that's always best, right? Because it's something that you slowly build. So the other things, the psychedelics or whatnot, the quicker fixes, aren't necessarily like building that muscle, but I'm sure it helps, but it's definitely not my approach. So I think any kind of practice that you have that you can do, and then even better if you have a practice with others. And the things that I lean on, because I'm very much like, I have a hard time sitting, like I'm the person who needs like the visualizations to like get to that space, unless I'm like creating something and I have a direction in my art. So the kinds of things that I use, and I think one is like kind of knowing what you need to create a couple of tethers. So like visualizations work really well for me. And when I do my work, it actually helps a lot and works really well for me, because I'm doing it in a group, and there are things like nice sounds, right? So I say sounds, guided visual meditations work well for me.
Yeah.
I also would say just being in nature. And again, like that isn't necessarily easy for everybody. So, to like kind of access that place. But let me just think a couple moments about some simple access points. So that, yeah, I guess maybe they're not all that simple, or maybe too simple, right? So sometimes when something's too simple, it can be very hard. But I use nature like all the time. I use water all the time, like even being in cold water, like swimming in cold water, being out in nature in the elements, always opens me up almost immediately, particularly in the elements. So I think that's one. And another one is just like maybe starting to kind of notice when you have that open space. So it's like noticing the kinds of thoughts that come through that feel like they're coming from that open space, and noticing like kind of how they feel or what kind of things they are, maybe even writing them down, so that you're starting to recognize when you're having those open spaces. And certainly I find that art practice of any kind of creative practice is it just has an inroad. I'll have to think about this more, about like some really simple things. One other thing come to mind. I'll just say this and then I'll let you go here. So any kind of repetitive stuff, and a lot of spiritual practices use that, but I'll do that in my art where I'm like, okay, I'm stuck. I need that open space. I'm going to create some kind of project where I have to like sew on tiny beads over and over, something repetitive that gets me in that space. Anyway, there you go.
No, that's really good. And I was going to say earlier, you touched on two important things. So one of them was shortcuts, and the other one is flexing the muscle. And again, I'm not passing judgment on, psychedelics, ayahuasca, or, any of these things, because, they actually free the person up from any sort of emotional, pain points that are holding them back or insecurities, and just, allow the creativity to flow. But I always think it would be nice if you didn't have a crutch, that you could just, automatically flow from the time you wanted to. But, even if you're leveraging off things like nature, that's much more healthier. Or if you're leveraging off things like water or music or sound, like you're saying, you still do need some sort of starting point. Even if you're just going inside with meditation, that is your starting point to leverage. And like you're saying, this is almost like a muscle. So it's like with any muscle, it's repetition, and conditioning. The more you do the exercise, the better you get at it, the more you're flexing that muscle. And then you begin, like you say, to recognize those open spaces. And then, you will reach a point where you can just get into the zone and get out of the zone, right? Because that's really all it is just releasing your insecurity so that that flow state can flow through you, which it does naturally in all of us, right?
Yes, absolutely. Absolutely. And it really is, like you're saying, it is, it is a muscle. It is innate in us. And sometimes it takes a jump start, and, everybody gets a little different kind of jump start. I think if one could lean more heavily into exercising the muscle, and not always going to the shortcuts, I think it will create more of a long and sustaining connection that actually can flow throughout your day, where you start to notice synchronicities and things of that sort.
Sure. And, I've also got a theory, or I should say a hypothesis, that if you did it in a very sort of sober state, your art would be much better than, if it was, drawn from such crutches, because, the power we have in our conscious waking sober state is absolutely, phenomenal. Our ability to be sharp and recognize things. And again, it's just, releasing those insecurities. With the work you do with the three mountain waters, I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about this, because this is very interesting. I mean, just generally, you encourage people to bring water from, different parts of the world, and then you give them, this drop of water in their hand, and then you sort of meditate and focus on that, which is very interesting. If you could talk a bit about that.
Yeah, absolutely. So that piece comes from the Waterkeeper's Library. And yeah, so I do invite people to gather water with gratitude. So there's a certain way in which I request the water to be gathered. And then I present it in an art installation. And I invite people to choose one of those bodies of water and put a little drop in their hand. And then I guide a meditation to connect with the water. So instead of thinking about connecting to your intuition, creative self, and imagination, as we were talking before, this is like a focused connection on connecting to the consciousness of the natural world, and in this case, water. So yes, I'll leave it at that so far, unless you have another question with that. The three mountain waters is a whole other thing, and I could go into, okay, I'll say one more thing about that. So I also find that when, whatever efforts, if you're trying to go a little deeper in something, there really is something to be said with how much you give is how much you get. So with the three mountain waters, when I went on a trip to gather some water, and I went on this trek, and so I walked, a lot of miles, 36 miles in 3 days to get the water, to gather the water and connect with the water. And, that exchange opened up everything. I had so many dreams and visions through the whole trip. but I had to give something, right? I had to offer something and instead of just like take. So in that exchange, it very much opened that space of communication. Yeah.
And what are you giving? Are you giving, like, say, gratitude, so a sentiment, or are you giving something physically, or in terms of the offering?
Yeah. So it just depends, like how I like to kind of open up that space for me. And that, so I think what you give back can be private. It can also be very cultural.
Yeah.
So, everybody can have something, and maybe it's just going with an ask and a gratitude. And even if it's as simple as like, thank you so much, and I'm saying it out loud in my language, out into the air. So it really can be anything. And in this case, for me, it was putting in that physical effort, which was a lot for me. And that was part of the exchange. That was the gift there. But it really can be anything, depending on your own practices, and depending on, I don't think that there's a wrong way to do it, but there is something that you get back, right, when you say thank you for something.
Well, that's a very nice sentiment. I mean, I find, at least with myself, and I'm sure this is true with other people, it might resonate, that when we're in a sort of taking mode, we hardly think about giving. We sometimes take it for granted. I mean, we might show up to someone's house for a potluck and we'll bring something, and we'll receive something. But when we're going out into nature, when we're going for forest baths or, nature walks, hiking, things like that, to glean peace from nature, healing from nature, it's always in a receiving mode. And we might not, give back to nature, even if it's something as simple, like you're saying, as gratitude. And that's really important to keep that cycle going.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think in terms of connecting directly to the natural world through these modes that we're talking about, has everything to do with gratitude, and how much we can get it hook into that connection with that consciousness of the water or the natural world.
Yeah, and even if, in the real world, with something as simple as, visiting your family doctor, they might have, cured you from something immediately with a prescription, or, even if it was through natural therapy, or, your surgeon who, saved you from something that was life-threatening. And, we don't really send them a holiday card in December, or,
yeah.
send them a thank you note, or we take it for granted and leave the office and, we're off to our lives.
Definitely. And knowing that others are doing the same motivates me, and it motivates everybody, like I also am like, oh yeah, that's right. The gratitude, the more we do it, it's enculturated. Yeah.
And, there again, like building up the collective consciousness. If everyone was doing it, then there's something you feel collectively.
Yes.
I wanted to ask you, with these interactions that you do, what are some of the changes you might see in people? And again, these are not maybe lifelong changes, but just from, spending some time with them, doing the interactive interaction, what are some of the changes you might see in them from when they first started and from when they go? Would it be things like a smile on their face, or, confidence might have increased, or some sense of peace, or?
Yeah. I mean, there's definitely, I think at the very basic level, it's like gratitude for the invitation to step into a sacred moment and connect, because it's not really folded into the, secular Western lifestyle. So I find that people are like, wow, like, yeah, okay, I could have walked here on my own and sat with a tree, but like having somebody hold that space and guide you through a deeper connection within a group is different. There's something, it's like that's one, the space is held. Two, it's like, yeah, there's like a structure to it, like the museum, or like, or like the art gallery, that it gives it a little bit of a space for that to be done. And I think people are very great. I know I am when I have that space held. I think people are very grateful, even at the most simple level, to have that opportunity to sit and start to use that muscle. So it's like, it can be anything from people being like, wow, I saw this thing. And other people are like, I didn't see anything, but I feel relaxed. And that's enough.
No, sure. I mean, it's like, sitting in front of the Mona Lisa and just watching it. And, if you're allowed to, maybe even touch the paint, which you shouldn't do, but, just to be interactive with it and being able to spend, even if it's 15 minutes, just yourself alone with the Mona Lisa rather than, the hustle and bustle of the other people coming and going and, the shuffling of feet in the museum. And you're right, it makes a huge difference. And then if you do that with a group, again, that's the collective consciousness expanding on that.
Yeah. Yeah. And it's really time. It's time, and time is precious. So when we invest in just a little bit of time, it gives back so much.
Got it. No, that's amazing. And if I can ask you one final question, because
Sure.
you are involved with museums, what would you say, and this, based on just your own personal thoughts, what would you say currently in our lifetime is one of the best exhibits we have in any museum around the world that you might know of? And this could be personal to you, right?
Yeah. That's a great question. So I'm more of a contemporary art person. So
Yeah.
that's where I lean.
Okay.
I mean, I love, museums that have more ancient things, but I'm very much about like, what is now and what are we bringing into the world now? And what is our direction now? So with that said, I guess, if there was an exhibit now where I live, I would probably, are you asking for like a specific exhibit or more of an idea? Like
it could be either or. And I like that you said it, because traditionally with museums, we think of the past, but you're bringing it to the now, which is important also.
Yeah, I mean, it's
Either
all
or.
connected, right? But I definitely have just always been somebody who is like, I want to know what we want now,
Yeah.
like where we are now, what we want now, and how to kind of activate that. So that's kind of what I lean into.
Okay. No, that's great. And if people want to find out more about your work or to contact you, where's the best place to reach you?
Sure. So I'll give you a couple things. Like my art website is faithjohnson.net. That's NET. And my Full Circle Arts business, which is art and meditation, is full-circle-arts.com. And I can be reached via email at FullOArts@gmail.com. I have 2 emails, but we'll just go with that. How about that?
Sure, no problem. And I'll put those in the show notes as well.
Okay, great.
Okay. And thanks again for coming on the episode, and I wish you well.
Thank you so much.